Okay, so again, I've got a long block tomorrow. So what we're going to do is suspend some of our usual warm ups and do it in a bigger chunk. Especially because what I'm giving you right now is so much of the mechanics of how the legislative branch works that the questions would be it's a big list of questions, but the answers are really kind of small. Um, again, the one thing I do want you holding on to is all of those small mechanical differences between the House and the Senate do explain the differences in character of the House and Senate. Does explain why they need different procedures and rules. All right, so do kind of keep that in mind. That it's not just about remembering, um, numeric differences and structural differences. It's thinking about the implications of those numeric and structural differences. All right. In terms of continuing to distinguish the legislative branch and the two houses, we were beginning to look at the leadership structure. All right, and House and Senate have different. They have both parallel but different leadership positions. One thing that makes the House unique is their figure at the top. Who leads the House of Representatives? Who's the top official in the House? Good. Kelly. Yeah, the Speaker of the House is the formal leader of the House. What makes this figure so powerful? Again, you could get a potential essay question talking about the powers of leadership and how they use it to influence anything, really. Another branch, legislation, the media, whatever it might be. So think of some of their formal powers, some of the things that the Speaker can do. Yeah, and that's powerful. Again, if I control debate, I can kind of steer the fate of legislation and policy, right? Good. What else? Nick in the back.
They're normally for like the majority of the people in the House.
So they represent the majority party. How do they use that to their advantage? What you want to look is that they can steer that majority, right? That as the leader of the majority, they can use that position to kind of say, okay, I want you guys to get in line to vote on this and to do that. But they need both the carrot and stick for that as well. Maybe not just the position, but the carrot and stick, which is what? How do they kind of keep people in line?
They control the committees and seats so they can kind of steer a person's career in a certain way.
Good. So I'm going to, give you either the choice committee positions or the ones that aren't choice. I'm going to give you the ones that really line up with your district. I don't know, someone from New York, let's say it's a congressman, they're from an urban area, does not want to be in the agricultural committee. That's someone from the Midwest. So don't think that, whether a committee is good for you or not really does depend on your constituents. So that's a factor to consider. And I can kind of give you the choice committee based on your constituents, or I can hold it back. I can give you the ones that have high profile and prestige, that control money, that control foreign policy, or I can, again, kind of hold them back. What else can they kind of determine the fate of? What else can they kind of steer?
Well, if the speaker determines, what goes on, why couldn't, a Republican speaker just, decide not to vote on any Democratic bills at all?
I guess they tend to do that. All right, so you're saying there's a Democratic speaker with a Democratic majority.
No, a Republican speaker with a...
So it would be a Republican majority.
Yeah, but if a Democratic bill passes in the Senate, does the House have to vote on it?
No. So we're going to get into today how a bill becomes a law. And in order for a bill to pass and become law, it does have to pass through both chambers. Just because it goes through one chamber doesn't mean that the other chamber has to consider it. That bill has to be introduced in the other chamber and put on the formal calendar and go through the committee system and then eventually come to floor action. And so if you've got two different chambers of two different kind of parties, it can be dead on arrival. If it passes in the House and then goes to the Senate, but it passes in the House in a different version, Let's say they pass two different versions of the same bill. Where do you think it goes next? They both authorize, expanded airstrikes against ISIS, but they do it in a kind of a different manner. One's using the Navy's Air Force, one's using the Air Force. Can you have two different versions of the same bill? You don't know yet. No, you can't. So it's got to go back. They're going to have what's called a conference committee. They're going to work out a third version, and back it goes through both chambers. When it eventually passes through both chambers in the same version, where's it go next? Once a bill is passed by, Congress, is it law? Kelly's shaking her head. President, right? So you can't, you've got to get all your ducks in a row. That's a long answer for that question, but that hopefully helps. Speaking of bills, what's the Speaker's power with regards to bills? I can assign members to committees. I've just given you the answer. Brian, what answer have I given you? I can assign members to committees. What else can I assign to committees? The bills. You have to do it with the Rules Committee. You have to do it with the leadership structure. But in sending bills to particular committees, again, I can control the fate of bills, right? We're going to get into that more, the committee system. I'm kind of assuming a bit of background knowledge already that, let's just kind of put it out there. As we get into how a bill becomes a law, does it make sense to go, and I told you about the floor and what it, kind of looks like. It's disheartening. There's not a lot of people in there. They come in for 10-minute speeches. They leave. They don't listen to the next person. And they give a speech to an empty room, right? So floor action is a little underwhelming. It's in part, again, why did I say that there's, floor action is almost more of a formality? Why aren't members in the chamber listening to other members and actually having debate? Yeah, it's not efficient, is it? It's everything is a matter of the public record. It wouldn't be part of the democratic process if we weren't making it public and transparent. So we're going to have it broadcast on C-SPAN. We're going to have it written in the congressional record. It's not efficient for me to sit there and listen to all of this. Well, if no one's listening, though, why do they still do it as well?
So then they can show people
Good.
that they actually this was what they were shooting for.
This is what I was doing for you and your and
elected.
our constituents. Absolutely. This is something that I was doing to kind of help things out. So again, floor action isn't always where it's at. And does it make sense? I've got this. What are we going to do with the continuing looming threat in that is ISIS? The next kind of the 2.0 version of Al Qaeda. That is threatening to drag us back into conflict in Iraq as, it expands from Syria. We didn't know where we didn't like the Assad regime, but we were reluctant to put boots on the ground, and we couldn't figure out who on the other side was the right, person to side up with. And now we've got this third party ISIS that's kind of in the middle, further complicating it. Should we sit down with 535 members of Congress and debate that? Is that efficient? What do you guys do as a class when you've got to, execute something like that senior wall was fantastic that you guys did. How did that develop, right? Did you do it organically, or were there committees? Would have been better if there were committees. I see grins. Committees are a way that you divide up the labor and you get people to kind of focus on what needs to be done in specialized groups. Okay? They develop expertise. That expertise is, used to be more efficient. They'll comb through the legislation. They'll make a recommendation. And based on the recommendation, that's what everyone else decides. So you go committees first, floor action second. All right? Long story short, sending a person to a committee or a bill to a committee is a way to kind of control their fate. Now, that's the top official. But what you're going to see is that the Speaker of the House is a leader of the entire House. So in other words, I'm not going to say that the individual can't be partisan, can't favor a party. But they have a larger kind of responsibility, and for that reason, they put someone more directly in control of the kind of the party agenda, and that's the House Majority Leader. All right, so that the speaker can control the big picture in terms of legislation, and not just focus narrowly on party. They put a second in command here, the House Majority Leader. Again, how do we decide who's going to, what party controls majority positions and what party controls minority positions? Should be an obvious question, again, since we went over it yesterday. Whoever has the most. So when they decide, when you figure out, okay, let's say the Republicans have the most, what's the mechanism that they use to kind of nominate who they want to be their majority leader? What do they use? A caucus, right? So they'll caucus and they'll come up with their position. And with the Speaker of the House, because they're in charge of the entire House, you'll have the entire House vote on the Speaker, and invariably they pass because they control the majority. With the Majority Leader, the caucus will put them in place. Same thing with the Minority Leader. Okay, what's different about their position? We're going to have some language here. They're really, again, focused on the party agenda. So they're the chief strategist and spokesperson for the majority party, because they can narrowly focus. They don't have to, be responsible for being perhaps slightly above politics in the interest of the chamber and legislation. For that reason, a good analogy is to think of them as shepherding legislation. And maybe instead of shepherding, legislation in the form of sheep, picture it as cats, right? Because to wrangle 435 members who have different ideological, they represent a whole range of different interests in terms of ideological, economic, geographic. There's a lot of factors that kind of pull people in different directions that party has a hard time holding together. Party is a blunt tool in many instances. So they've got to kind of keep everybody in line. That's their job. They're going to have to do it without the kind of formal constitutional powers that the Speaker has. They can use leadership position, and they certainly have the ear of the Speaker, and they can work together to say, this guy's not in line. What incentives, what disincentives can we put forth? But mostly what they're relying upon is their skill, their personality, the energy that they bring to the job. A nice classic example is a former speaker called Tom DeLay, who was nicknamed the Hammer. What a great nickname. Because I smash. Hulk smash was his, perhaps approach. He was known as this kind of vigorous, no holds barred kind of speaker. And that kind of shows you, again, the role that personality plays. The minority leader is exactly the same, but for the minority side. And if you're thinking of an analogy again, they don't control the majority. So unless they find common ground, unless there's some sort of compromise issue, are they going to get their legislation passed? No, right? So what's their main role as the minority group? What do you think?
To argue against the majority?
Yeah, just to be kind of the brakes to the majority party. They're there to be the opposition. They're there, in a sense, to play defense. It's you would hope that they're there to find common ground and to find avenues of compromise, but we've got kind of entrenched mentalities on both sides of the parties lately where compromise is that dirty word. And more often than not, it's about kind of, blocking legislation, blocking parts of agenda. At any rate, that's the position of the minority leader. We also have whips, which are, I guess, kind of exactly what they sound like. There's not a, this is not a kind of a euphemism for something more kind of, gentle and serene. A whip is someone that is, you want to envision using some sort of torture device to keep you in line. They're there to whip you into shape. They're there to kind of whip you back to behaving and performing, all right? So the whips, again, they're the kind of the muscle. They're the, they're going to be, in part, the eyes and ears of the majority leader and the speaker, or the minority leader, because the minority side has whips as well. And they're going to be doing the daily kind of, like, I'm monitoring, I'm tracking, and I'm doing the things to keep you in line. So again, you want to know tactics. You want to know specific things that they can do. And the first thing is just knowing where everyone is, knowing what the temperature in the room is. They know before any legislation reaches the floor what the vote is, because they've been going around knocking on doors, having conversations, making phone calls. They know where every one of the members of their delegation stands on that particular issue, and that then gives them the idea of like, how many do we need to swing? Do we have this in lockdown, or do I need to bring 5 more members on to get this thing to pass? And once they know the 5 members that they need to have, this is, by the way, called a nose or head count. I'm counting heads. I don't know why I'd count noses instead of heads, but that's another way to say it. Once I know it, then I've got a couple of strategies. Like, one is simply getting you to the floor. I know I've got the votes, but members routinely don't show up sometimes because they don't think you're going to notice. You're going to see how transparent Congress is. Not only do they report their own votes, it's all part of the public record, but you can go to any interest group website and see exactly how they voted on things. And they hope that you don't notice sometimes because, what better way to avoid getting killed over a controversial issue than not vote on it? What did you do on Syria? Well, did you vote for airstrikes because people died? No, I didn't vote for airstrikes. Did you not vote for airstrikes because people died? No, I didn't vote not for airstrikes. Right? Easy way to kind of keep your hands clean. So sometimes they don't want to go to the floor. Sometimes they're, busy. The whip literally will, himself or somebody else will knock on the door and say, hey, there's a floor vote, don't you? And there's lights that flash in the Capitol. There's all kinds of little signals that say, hey, it's a floor vote. Don't you see the lights? Let's get going. They can also use the power of persuasion. Again, a lot of this is centralized. So they use their team, their staff to provide summaries, to provide kind of overviews of the bills, and they're going to try to persuade you. If that doesn't work, then they're going to use the arm twisting kind of measures, favors and punishments. Now, again, we can talk about the fate of a member in terms of committee, but what about their legislation? You need to tell your district you've done things for them. This bill is a great way to show your district you've done things for them. It would be a shame if it didn't pass. I know it's going to pass if leadership gets behind it. There's a subtle threat. I'm not going to help you with regards to leadership. How about re-election? You remember seeing the costs of re-election? Anybody remember the numbers? What do you remember?
Like 1.5 million for the House and
Good.
then like 11 point something for the Senate.
Yeah, 11 million in change in the Senate. That's a lot of money to raise, right? Where do they get some of that money? Well, they get it from all kinds of different sources, and we'll talk about that. But some of it comes from party. The political parties have funds that they can direct to races because, again, they want to maintain the majority in the chamber. And, this seat is vulnerable and it might fall to the other party. Let's direct some money there. So we can kind of tell you that, hey, we're not going to support your legislation. We're not going to support your committee bid. We're not going to support your chairmanship bid. We're not going to support your reelection bid. A lot of arm twisting that kind of can go on. All right. Clerks are I guess, simply, and secretaries of the Senate are the administrative arm. Everything is part of the written record. There's procedures. There's protocol. And they're the ones kind of on top of it. What does the rule say about this? What's procedurally, what has to happen next? All right. In terms of putting names and faces together. And by the way, I love kind of where we're at. And keep in mind, we're kind of in that interim between elections and inauguration. You got to kind of read bottom up. So at 9:39 the other day, the House convened. They returned from a recess. There was a report that was filed, and then they moved to adjourn. 9:39, by 9:41, there was a motion to adjourn. That's on the floor, all right? So again, it's like, you got to be kidding me. They were at work for 3 minutes, and then what did they go do? They went and had tacos. Looks like there's nothing going on, and they'll do it again today because they're in that kind of, that recess period. So it was by a voice vote, too. I'd like to see how many people are in there. So they're going to, again, meet at 9 o'clock today. They're not quite at work yet. And they'll probably be there for 3 minutes and then tap out, okay? Who's behind all of this? Oh, here they are. again, if I click on committees, you're going to see that there's plenty of work going on. I have a web quest, so it's going to be a little bit better for you guys, but I can blow this up a little bit. That didn't help too much. I don't think you can't quite see the faces. John Boehner is the Speaker of the House. All right. The Majority Leader is a guy named Kevin McCarthy, and then you see whips under them. Steve Scalise. On the Democratic side, the Minority Leader is Nancy Pelosi, and then Steny Hoyer, I like Steny, I like that name, is the whip. What's interesting, again, is if you have elections and the balance changes, the Minority Leader becomes the Majority Leader, potentially, like 9 times out of 10. And conversely, often the Speaker goes, they might, you got to figure out what to do with their Majority Leader. But there's this kind of, today's Minority Leader is tomorrow's potential Majority Leader or Speaker. It happened in reverse in that Nancy Pelosi was the former Speaker of the House, and when they lost control of the House, she went to being the Minority Leader. Okay? So, at any rate, I have an exploration where you'll begin to look at those faces a little bit more. Now, in the Senate, different structure. Because, again, it comes down to numbers. With the House and with 435 members, you need to preside over debate. Otherwise, you have chaos. With 100 members and a lot of them choosing not to show up often, you don't need as much of a formal kind of system of rules in terms of debate, in terms of procedures. Again, an example of that is they recess. They hit the pause button, they go out, and they come back and they pick up right where they left off. Whereas the House adjourns to a day certain, and they come back and they have to start all over again because they need to have those procedures in place to kind of keep it from getting chaotic. For that reason, in the House, the presiding officer truly presides. In the Senate, they sit up there and they try not to fall asleep. Because there's not a lot of, they don't get to, there isn't, for example, control over the length of time that you talk. There isn't rules regarding how many bills you can talk about at the same time. So, multiple points of debate can be going on for extended periods of time. There's not a lot of presiding. So, they don't need that formal officer up front. What they need is actually something quite different due to numbers. There's 100 senators. Let's think about a vote and a potential scenario that's a game kind of stopper. We got to vote on Syria, to authorize more airstrikes or not. I got 100 votes. What potentially could happen? And we're stalemated. We're stymied. 50-50. We could get a tie. For that reason, what they need in terms of the leadership position is someone from outside the chamber. The vice president, one of the only, points where the vice president is relevant, beyond elections. Vice president does not have a lot of relevance after elections. During elections, they're there to show the president's decision-making abilities. They're there to balance the ticket. They're there to bring, potential constituents that were supporting them to the vote, and then they get to be vice president. They get mothballed often. James Madison or John Adams described it as the worst office that ever existed or that mankind could conceive of. I didn't do his quote perfectly, but not only is it the worst job in the world, it's the worst one we can think of. And then it was, I think it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president who said it's not worth a warm bucket of spit. How much would you pay for a warm? I would pay you to get it away from me. I didn't want to. I'm going to pay you not to put that idea in my head, right? Terrible office, but occasionally they get to break ties, and that's they count electoral returns. They do whatever the president asks them. Often it's just funerals and ribbon cutting ceremonies. Sometimes they get a niche, a thing that they can have as a pet project. But man, occasionally they get to break ties, and that's pretty cool. All right, that's what they're there for. Do they know ties are coming? Yes. Does the vice president want to sit in the Senate chamber? That's probably even more humbling than anything else. At least, I got an office I can retreat to and pretend that I'm doing important work while I play Angry Birds. In the Senate, I'm up there on the camera and just trying not to fall asleep, right? So he's not going to be there unless they know a tie is looming. For that reason, they're going to have another person kind of be in charge of presiding over the Senate. And because it doesn't have a lot of power, this is more of a ceremonial, I don't want to use the word tokenal, but they use it as a way often to acknowledge service. So the president pro temp, you see the word temporary in there, is the kind of the person that presides in the absence of the vice president. What they typically do is they base this selection on seniority. And consequently, what you have is like the oldest guy in the chamber. And in the case of the Senate, with people serving 6-year terms and having that incumbency advantage, you got some pretty elderly guys. Strom Thurmond was a great example. He was a longtime speaker of President Pro Tem that was, serving well into his 90s. There was, and I don't mean to be cavalier or kind of callous about it, but they literally had aides kind of helping him go into rooms and remember why he was there. He was starting to have some issues of senility. He died at I want to say 101, 102. He finally did retire and then died around 100. The reason this is all chilling is where is the president pro tem in terms of the presidential succession? Goes president. Who's next? VP. Speaker.
And then cabinet heads.
President pro tem. So technically third in line to the president, he's being helped into rooms, right? They pick typically the oldest member. This guy was a Dixiecrat. This guy ran on a segregationist platform for president. That's how old he was, and he was kind of, put in there as Speaker of the House. Byrd was the next guy, and he was also in his 90s. So at any rate, they pick an older individual, and again, it signifies that this kind of lacks some significant power. Again, the president pro tem has a pro tem. They'll send a junior, even though they're in there subbing for the vice president, they'll send a sub in for themselves. It's like the sub calling in sick and saying, can you find a sub for me? Still pay me. So this is typically rotated around the junior members. For this reason, again, when we talk about the true leader of the Senate, you got to skip past the president of the Senate, the president pro tem, and you got to go all the way down to the majority leader. All right? The majority leader is the actual true leader of the Senate. They don't have, again, a lot of the same tools that the Speaker of the House does over in the other chamber. They lack those constitutional powers. So, again, they've got to rely on leadership style, the use of kind of carrot and stick, the use of incentives and disincentives, as opposed to those kind of formal powers. Because, again, the Senate is much more independent and much less kind of structured in terms of rules. We've got a minority position and then whips as well. Let's see if my link still works so that you can see. All right. There's Joe Biden. I should bring up another GIF of him. Your president pro tem is Patrick Leahy from Vermont. What's interesting, again, is there's Harry Reid. He's the majority leader. I'm going to go down a little bit here. All right. There's Mitch McConnell. What's going to happen? And he's the minority leader. What's going to happen in January with the new inauguration?
He's going to become majority leader.
Yeah, and he's already kind of out there in the media as the chief source that they go to for kind of the current, the future direction of the Senate. We've already made the switch over to him as majority leader. You haven't seen much of Harry Reid lately, so those two positions are about to flip-flop, okay? And he will become the most powerful individual in the Senate. He'll lead the minority, all right? So what I've been kind of hinting at here is some procedural differences. I'm gonna come back to that bit at the top here in a second. What you see in the House, and again, there's been essay questions that have simply asked you to kind of think about how the chambers are different and why, and what impact could it possibly have on legislation, right? Think of those tiered questions. Well, what you see is, again, I've already indicated, a stronger central leadership in the House and less so in the Senate. That stronger central leadership starts with the Speaker, but you also are going to see a Rules Committee that has a powerful role in the House. What you see in the Senate is not necessarily Rules Committee because they don't have those rules about length of debate, number of pieces of legislation that you can debate at the same time, when you can introduce legislation. It's a little more kind of freewheeling. All right. Numbers also mean that leadership and committee positions are less evenly divided. I have X amount of leadership and committee positions to go around. I'm dividing it by 435 here and 100 here. So these guys get more committee positions, more leadership positions. It's again why they have perhaps a little more prestige. These guys get less. And what it means is if you're going to make yourself a name and if you're going to be powerful, you better use those few things that you are assigned to your advantage. You better specialize. So even though they're thought of as the more kind of informed group, they often have to be more generalist over in the Senate because of the number of committees and positions that they have. In the House, again, what you're going to see is, it's funny, this group has bigger challenges to their positions. They have sometimes perhaps a higher profile when it comes to making legislative decisions that hopefully the 6 years kind of makes people forget. But you see more of kind of a fluctuation with their incumbency rate than you do over here. That having been said, there's a higher turnover rate here. People don't stay a member of the House kind of for life typically. Whereas in the Senate, you will see people serving, Kennedy and Kerry were 50 years in the chamber, okay? So higher turnover here, lower turnover there. Another important procedural difference is the idea of initiating revenue bills in impeachment proceedings on this side. We start with the more democratic body when it comes to spending money. If anybody's going to authorize spending money and raising revenue, it's going to be here. Then this side will approve. Speaking of approval, the other major difference is that they have the power of advice and consent. Remember that phrase, that's a check that is unique to the Senate when it comes to treaties, when it comes to appointments. They are the body that checks the president in a number of ways using that power of advice and consent. Also, they're the other end of the impeachment proceedings where they will, vote to convict. Okay? What's the same? Well, there are still some holdovers in terms of their character. What behaviors are expected. I don't know if you guys remember, there was a point where the president was giving the State of the Union, and he was, as he talked about a bill and its impact, I think was on immigration, there was a guy in the chamber who yelled, "You lie." Do you remember that? Can I find it? Pretty famous. I mean, it comes
There are
up
also
that quick.
those who claim that our reform efforts would ensure illegal immigrants. This too is false. The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally.
Look at her face.
It's not true. And one more misunderstanding I want to clear up.
They are freaking out in the background.
No
Look at her.
federal dollars will be used to fund abortion.
Okay, that's just a little. You don't do that, and you hear, whoa, the whole chamber. And this guy, became part of the 24-hour news spin. And Nancy Pelosi's her head spinning, like, where is this guy? And she's looking at her chart. You don't do that necessarily. They do have kind of rules, although they've broken. They're twittering from the floor now. It's again, it's a different chamber and age. So I think Alex just had a whole black screen for like 10 minutes. There is, he didn't get to see the UI. There is rules, and one of them is loyalty to your chamber, that the House is the Democratic body, the Senate is not Democratic, they're both Democratic, but they're the kind of the House that's closer to the people. The Senate gets to be the more stewards of Congress, where they get to kind of think of higher things, perhaps. But you're supposed to be civil as you're doing this. You're supposed to be respectful and polite. So even if you're driving me nuts, I'm going to say my distinguished colleague from wherever you are is completely mentally deranged and confused. I'm going to at least start with my distinguished colleague before I call you deranged and confused. We're going to respect seniority. and there's perks that come along with that. Key terminology. Reciprocity is kind of the rule of the game. We've gotten away from compromise, perhaps. There's a lot of stalemate. There's another word, gridlock. I gave you that before, right? What's gridlock? It's a traffic terminology.
Like nothing's been done.
Yeah, you can't get anything done. And in the traffic analogy is like I got a four-way intersection, and what's happened?
Everyone's looking right.
Here we go. I'm going, right? I don't care if that light's about to change. I'm going, and you get stuck, halfway across the light, and then the other side can't go, and then we're frozen, right? You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to follow this concept of reciprocity. This, I'll do you a favor, you do me a favor, because it's in both of our interests. They actually call it log rolling. How many of you watched the ESPN 42 and the lumberjack games? Oh man, you got to tune into. They're doing stuff with chainsaws, and they're climbing, poles with like spikes and axe throwing, and lumberjack games are awesome. And one of the things they'll do, because they're bored and they're in the woods, is they'll get out there on a log in the middle of a river, and two guys will try to stand up, and then they'll try to knock each other off by running. Log rolling, to stay up, you got to run in the same direction. So they'll literally go run, 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 and then they'll reverse it, run, 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 run. Fun stuff. Again, this is an old institution. They use old-timey kind of references. Anybody log roll still? Go out there in Pawtucket Pond and no? Okay. There's a summertime activity. Compromise is another kind of key idea, that you're supposed to be willing to alter or amend your position. That not only am I going to do favors, but I'm willing to meet you in the middle. And then specialization is kind of a rule. What we're going to transition into is how these chambers, again, although they're unique, approach the process of making a bill into a law. And I'm going to try to use my long block to my advantage for that. We're going to kind of jump a little out of the lecture sequence, and we're going to kind of look at how a bill becomes a law. They're not in session yet. There's like a watch live. All right, I'm not going to find them in session yet because there'd be a button up front. Well, we're gonna look at them and say, we're better time tomorrow to kind of look at them in session. We're going to watch them C-SPAN. You're going to be gripped by it. And what we're going to do is go through this whole procedure of skip right to here, how a bill becomes a law. And then you guys are going to kind of diagram it out for me. You're going to construct a little bit of a flow chart if I can do things kind of quickly in looking at this process. So, bill. How many of you at Schoolhouse Rock? I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill. There you go. You've got everything you need. That bill, what do we mean by it? What is a bill? Not a law, so what's a bill? Go ahead, Kelly. It's a proposed law, right? The first thing you need to know is that a proposed law can take a bunch of different forms. There's all different kind of shapes to it. So bills are proposed laws, and they can come from typically a variety of sources. What's going to be the first thing that's surprising to you is members of the House and the Senate aren't often the authors of the bills. That a lot of the ideas for legislation come from the executive branch because, again, singular nature of the executive branch means they can be a little more centralized. They can direct staff to use the power and the expertise of the executive branch to draft legislation, and then they bring it to an appropriate member to introduce. Executive branch can write legislation, but they can't formally introduce it. They can't get the House to, put it into the mechanisms that get that bill going. Interest groups, similarly, can draft legislation. My gosh, do they have expertise and money? And, this is about, making a new drug available and speeding up the FDA's approval process. What better company than Johnson & Johnson to use all of its money and expertise to write up a bill? And again, they find a friendly member to submit it. Bills come in different forms, though. The ideas can be shaped as either bills or resolutions. Bills can be public or private. Resolutions have three different forms. collectively, just if you were to guess, how many kind of bills and resolutions do you think the House considers or in the Senate considers in a given year? What do you think?
20,000.
20,000. That's not a bad guess. Is he high or low?
Low.
A little high. They're not quite that productive. This is a given legislative year, and you're going to see in the Senate side 4,000 and in the House side 6,000. All right. What percentage do you think pass?
0.5.
We're around. We're a little lower than 10. We're a little higher than 0.5. 5 is good though. 5%. All right. Again, all of this is part of the public record. So if you click on this, you can begin to see everything that they're talking about, and then you begin to ask yourself, do I want everything up here that they're thinking about passing? And it all sounds good. Death tax repeal, permanency act. I don't want a death tax. That sounds pretty good. Let's pass that. We're going to open up some of these and consider, what do we want to pass and what don't we? All right? Okay.